faster than the wind. You might ask, why is this or how this? Because the speed of the boat is dependent on how much energy it gets from the wind and not necessarily on the speed of the wind. You're going to ask your physics teacher if you want. You might be aware of it, but you can get a sailboat to go fast because the sails have to be much wider than the boat itself. But again, it all depends on how much energy your sails capture, and especially if the wind is right behind you and you're heading with the wind. But this went on for hundreds of years. Today it's somewhat obsolete because sailboats, oh yeah, they're still used for pleasure, but they're not for playing, but they're not used for trade anymore. There's, as far as I know, no passenger liner that uses sailboats. For a long time, people wondered if Africa did not extend all the way south around the globe, and they knew the earth was round at this point, but eventually we found that Africa had an end. The Portuguese sailor one Portuguese sailor got to the end of Africa, but his crew was afraid to go around it, so the next sailor who came after him, who had been part of the first crew, he went all the way around Africa and went to India from Portugal. And if they had read their history books, though, again, I can't blame them because the only history of it was written in Persian. But the Persians, 2,000 years before, had sailed across the Mediterranean, around Africa, and wound up back at the end of the Tigris-Euphrates River, way back around 1500 or so, around 500 or so BCE. So the Persians had told them, but keep in mind they did not have phones, they did not have the internet, and they did not have translators as such. I mean, so the Persian records were lost to most of humanity until recent times when they've been dug up. All right. Now, the trade with the Far East eventually died down owing to the fact that a new group of Africans moved in called the Bantu. The Bantu was an uncivilized people, but apparently they had lots and lots of children. The Bantu still survive to this day in Africa, and they're a big part of the population of East Africa, even to this day. But they tended to be mostly farmers, not traders, and they tended to live in tribes. And oftentimes, then the tribe would get to be about 200 people, then it split up. Grow again, each tribe grow about 200 people, and then they'd split up. And they would live by farming, by hunting, a little bit of herd. They had a few cattle, but mostly they were tribal. No writing, no education as such. The Bantu culture then became the dominant culture of Africa, and the light of civilization largely went out. Even though, again, I can't emphasize enough, though, that Africa contributed more to civilization than what we realized until recently. But eventually, now, I must state, too, particularly in Europe, the European history I know more about than I do other histories. Europe had a lot of uncivilized people, particularly for a long time the Germans were. My own Scottish ancestors were uncivilized. The Scandinavian people were for a long time uncivilized. Europe had a lot of uncivilized people, and these uncivilized people sometimes moved in and created havoc among the civilized. But eventually these people were taken in and they became what I call amalgamated or mixed in. And they became part of the European scene, and eventually today I'd consider every European country to be civilized. But in the case of the Africans, the uncivilized got the upper hand. Islam began to make inroads into Africa. Of course, you may know that Islam began in Arabia, and right across the Red Sea from Arabia, and the Red Sea is not very wide, so right across the Red Sea was Africa, Islam crossed into Africa from the Red Sea, and also when Islam conquered Egypt, they began to spread across North Africa. The Berber people living here resisted Islam for a while, but eventually they succumbed. But a lot of the Berbers did not stay around to become Islamic. They fled to Europe. And one man said, I used to travel in North Africa and see crowds of people, but now he said I can go across North Africa all day and not meet a soul. A lot of the non-Islamic people left. They resisted. Egypt, they welcomed Islam because they had to pay oppressive taxes to the Byzantine Empire, and they had been persecuted by the Eastern Orthodox Church. So but a lot of the Egyptians became Islamic, and Egypt is still Islamic to this day. Now, Islam had a couple of problems with the African people. Problem number one was polygamy. The African people practiced polygamy. Now, it is true that Muhammad allowed a man to have up to 4 wives, but a woman can only have 1 husband. But in Africa, a lot of women had more than 1 husband, and a lot of men had more than 4 wives. This was a problem that Christians had also. In fact, it was said that David Livingstone, when he converted an African chieftain who had 6 wives, he did not know what to tell the African chieftain about these 6 wives, so David Livingstone gave up missionary work and became an explorer. And someone else took up the missionary work. This was a problem that Islam had. The other problem was the priesthood. Africans had numerous priests. Islam insisted that there should be no priests, and the two religions could not really coordinate completely. But again, a lot of Africans embraced Islam, and some of them did not. Now, back to Ethiopia again. Ethiopia is possibly the oldest nation on earth. And I had a student this morning remind me that it's the first nation mentioned in the Bible. It's mentioned in Genesis, the 2nd chapter, as being a part of the earth right after creation, that they were formed right after creation. But they had a problem with their farming, and that they over-farmed the land, and this is something they still do. They keep on farming the same land, the same crops on the same land over and over again, and eventually the soil gets worn out. They are not great at using fertilizers, so this helps the desert to increase in size also. They over-farmed from the beginning, and this is something they still do. The country started off as a seafaring nation because it's in the east part of Africa. They would go to the Far East, and they would come back from the Far East. But eventually, as their land dried up, they got moved to the mountains where they found things safe. Islam continued to attack them, so they moved themselves to the mountains away from the seacoast, and the mountains protected them. They resisted Islam. They became Christian around the 300s, somewhere around in that period of time. They fought long wars with the Muslims, but they remained Christian. Now, I say that up until 1974, when the communists took over, and as far as the communists still have them, when Haile Selassie, the last emperor, was deposed. And if you ever, maybe not anymore, but the Jamaicans thought really highly of Haile Selassie for a long time. And they believed after his deposed that he was going to come back and win. He never did. Haile Selassie is deceased, and his descendants have not been able to come back and take over Ethiopia again. But at least Islam didn't get them. All right, now, in the western part of Africa, you had 3 nations, Ghana, Mali, and Zimbabwe. Actually, no, 2 nations in the western part, and then Zimbabwe's in the southern part. Ghana. and Mali. The one thing you want to remember about Ghana was it was a trading center. It appeared for a while, and this is true of so many countries, they appear, became rich, and then declined. We know very little about them, but what we know about them, they did practice the religious beliefs of their African ancestors, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. To sum up their religion in one word, it was animism. Worship of their ancestors, worship of nature, worship of spirits. And generally, animism is associated with primitive peoples, and Ghana was rich for a while, but then became primitive as scattered. Apparently, I mean, folks, civilized people have a couple of problems. Number one, they become soft. And number two, they don't have as many children as the uncivilized, and eventually the uncivilized outnumber them. Mali. Now, this one's interesting to me because of something that happened. I had a student from Mali about 2 or 3 years ago. He wrote his paper on Mali, and I don't encourage those of you from abroad to write a paper about your own country. I mean, I had a Jewish man one time wrote about Israel, and my wife and I happened to know his grandparents. And I said, from what I know about you, you could have written this paper off the top of your head, and you didn't learn anything by writing it. I want you to do research. This man was from Mali. He wrote about Mali, particularly a certain Mali king. Mali was becoming an Islamic country, and this king had gotten wealthy, and he decided to make his once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage toward Africa. He started out in Timbuktu. I'll talk more about Timbuktu in a minute. From Timbuktu to Mecca was a long ways. In order to appease Allah, on his way to Mecca from Timbuktu, he would drop off alms to the poor people. And he kept doing this all the way to Mecca and kept doing this all the way back. When he got home, 2 things happened. Number one, he was broke, no money, and number 2, his people were broke also, so he couldn't collect taxes. Now, folks, you might think of a king as being rich. The only way a king can get money is to levy taxes. But if his people have no money to give him, then he's going to become poor also. And there have been kings, one king in Germany once was so impoverished that when he died, he had to will his crown he had to sell his crown to help pay off his debts. 2 generations of Spanish kings went bankrupt. King Philip II of Spain and his son, Philip III, both went bankrupt in turn. So, you know, kings can sometimes be very much impoverished. Now, the point I'm trying to make of all this, folks, is, and this is something I want you to watch out for as you read your history book. A king has no business giving money to the poor. No government does. Helping the poor is something that each of us need to do as individuals. Churches should. Individuals should. You set up charitable organizations such as the Jimmy Fund, the Red Cross, private organizations, government money. It's not really charity when it comes to government because the government takes the money from you at gunpoint, you might say. All right, I hope that made my point. Again, nations that have helped, for the governments have helped the poor wind up going under. If any of you don't like what I'm saying, you're welcome to your input is welcome. As far as liking, sometimes I don't like what I say. Anyway, Mali, now, the people of Mali helped convert a lot of that region of Africa to Islam. Now, their capital was Timbuktu. Yeah. My dad used to say often, it's as far away as Timbuktu. The reason for that expression is Timbuktu was far away. Yes. Far away from what? Far away from everything. Here was a problem that when Europeans began exploring Africa, they would hear that deep inside the Sahara Desert was a city, a big city called Timbuktu, And the Europeans would set out to try to find it, and it'd be turned back by the natives who did not want them to find it. Now, eventually, of course, Europeans developed the railroad, the automobile, the truck, and the road, highway, and the airplane. Eventually, Europeans did find Timbuktu, and the native local people there could not keep them out. But Europeans, for a while, only knew of Timbuktu as a place that might exist or might not. They didn't know for sure whether it existed or not, because none of them could get to it. I know the feeling. You think you're in the right class. I'm going to say this is not where I belong. All right, Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe is in South Africa. Which is Zimbabwe. It's in South Africa. They got rich through gold trade. Mostly gold. Now, folks, this is something we're going to find a lot of, and not only in Africa, but in Far East and even North America. They built a magnificent city, and for some reason they abandoned their city. We don't know why. Your author suggests they might have over-farmed of land, or they might have cut away too much of the jungle. Something went wrong. They abandoned their land, and hence we don't know much about their history, except we have found their city. It was a magnificent city. Now, this takes us to what eventually the Africans would become, and by the time the Europeans began to explore and find them, they became what your book calls stateless. And this is another way of saying tribal. And there were people who had no nation states as such. Small independent tribes. And occasionally a couple of tribes get together and merge, but for the most part these tribes could not stay together long. Now, you can compare the African people to the North American Indians. Stateless people tend to embrace what I will call communism, because that's basically what it is. Under communism, folk, everybody gets fed, whether he works or not. The lazy, the unproductive get rewarded the same way as the hardworking. The thrifty get their goods taken away from them and given to people who are not thrifty. And the result is their cultural level tends to go to zero, or it goes down really low. Again, similar to what happened to the American Indians. Everybody is supposed to work, but some people don't. And under capitalism, a person absolutely refuses to work, he can starve. That sounds cold and hard, I know. But under communism, under socialism, you get paid whether you work or not. All right. The stateless people had a real problem. They were the ones who were oftentimes taken in as slaves. Among the stateless people were Africa's Bushmen, and the Pygmies were people from Africa who were rejected by the other. The Pygmies, you might know, are really short people, averaging maybe about 4 feet tall, as opposed to the Watusi, who average 7 feet tall. The Watusi are the tallest people in the world, but not necessarily the healthiest. But the Bushmen tended to be Pygmies. But anyways, these people who were taken in as slaves. Now, which brings us to the topic of slavery. Slavery has been a part of Africa's history throughout all of recorded history. We know the ancient Egyptians practiced African slavery. The Romans did. Then for a while, Europeans quit practicing slavery and outlawed slavery. Then in the 1500s, the Europeans met the Africans again. and slavery got started again. Slavery was to persist in the New World until around 1880. The United States outlawed slavery in 1865. Brazil outlawed slavery in 1880. I've talked to a couple of Brazilian students about why another Brazilian I met one time who was not a student. But they both, they all said this, what happened with Brazil, they eventually sort of got shamed out of it. In other words, they became embarrassed, that, hey, we're the only nation left that still practices this. Then the slaves got really restless. The king didn't want to release them, so the king took the cabinet and went back to Portugal. You know, Brazil is affiliated with Portugal, and left his daughter in charge. And as soon as his daughter got in charge, she signed the bill releasing all the slaves. And that happened in 1880. And for all practical purposes, slavery was the thing of the past New World, but it was still going on in Africa. As recently as about 10 years or so ago, slavery was known to be practiced in the Sudan. In fact, it was practiced for years. And at one point, a bunch of Americans got together and purchased all the slaves to free them. The Sudanese said, hey, we can get a lot of money for these slaves, so they captured the freed slaves back. And there were people outside, well, hey, this is no way to get them freed. Well, the problem was discussed in the United Nations. It was discussed in the United States Senate. And eventually Sudan split into two nations, North and South. I do not know the status of slavery there now. I've also heard that slavery is still going on in some places in the Congo, the jungles, back parts of the Congo. But it's difficult to prove because some of these jungles are really, really difficult for outsiders to get into, owing to the fact that the water is filled with very large snakes and crocodiles. And owing also to the fact that the grasslands are very, very dense, and somehow these people can handle it, and outsiders can't. They can even navigate their way around and get through a grassland without getting snake bit or eaten by some wild animal. The rest of us better stay away. All right. Anyway. Their religion. In general, they believed in a creator God. Their religion, again, reminds me a lot of the religion of the North American Indians before Columbus came. The North American Indians called him the Great Spirit. The Africans believed in a creator also. Then they said this creator had brought forth a whole lot of lesser spirit beings. And these spirit beings were the ones who were put in charge of the world. So therefore, there were a lot of gods. And every phenomenon in the world had some kind of a god associated with it. There was a god for the river, a god for the sun, God for the moon. The way they communicated with the gods was through ritual. Again, ritual oftentimes involved a drum beat, and they learned how to get the right beat on a drum to summon up a spirit being. And this practice, I understand, is still going on to this day. It goes on, that they carried this practice with them to the West Indies, and this still goes on. Their ancestors, they worshiped their ancestors. Ancestor worship was extremely important. Shamanism, another name for shaman is witch man or witch doctor. Shamanism is part of it. The religion can be summed up in one word, animism. And animism is often associated with primitive peoples. Worship of spirits, you perform an apology to an animal every time you kill it, even if you have to kill it to eat it, to get it, or kill it for its hide or whatever, for its skin, you perform an apology. A lot of them embraced Islam. Islam made headway all the way through Africa, long before the Europeans came in. But the problem that Islam had with them, again, I've already mentioned two problems: priesthood and polygamy. Islam insisted that there be no priest. Africans used shamans as priests, but African people, by their nature, seem to be wanting priests to act as a go-between between the spiritual and the mundane. All right. Family life. Africans had fewer taboos between the sexes than other peoples. Polygamy was the norm. Now, what I'm about to say does not apply to all places, but applies to a lot of them. In a lot of places in Africa, African men could only pass their inheritance to their sister's children. You might say, why not his own children? The reason for that being, you knew who the mother of a child was. You always knew that, but you oftentimes did not know who the father was. So therefore, if a man and a woman had the same mother, they knew they were brother and sister. So if a man died, to make sure his wealth stayed in his family, he would pass his inheritance on to his sister's children. We might say, what if he had 2 or 3 sisters? Well, then they would divide up the inheritance among the 2 or 3 sisters and pass it on that way, rather than pass it on directly to his own children. All right. Want to say this also now. This is, I know I'm in a little Jewish community, but the ancient Jews, among Jews, you became what your father was. So if your father was from the tribe of Reuben, you were a Reubenite. If your father was from the tribe of Levi, you were a Levite. But today, the Jews reverse that, and they say you become what your mother is, for the same reason. You know who the mother of a child is. You don't know who the father is. Now, while I'm on this subject, in American history, you have a man named Benjamin Franklin. Hopefully, all of you heard of him. Benjamin Franklin brought up a child one time that he said was his, but we don't know who the mother was. That is very rare in the history, but it's happened to him. Anyway, but usually you know who the mother is. Now, the art. Art and music, mostly religious. Their art, now way back yonder, their art had an emphasis on painting, but somewhere along the way they seemed to lose their ability to paint and they started emphasizing sculpture. A lot of their sculpture was made out of wood, but a bunch of it was made out of stone also. They became excellent artists. Their artists often depicted human heads, but they did not strive for realism like the Greeks. They strove for what we might call surrealism. In other words, human head would have exaggerated features, lips larger than human lips actually are, or eyes larger than human eyes actually are. And they would often depict animals in their sculpture also. Their music, all right, folks, what I'm about to say, a lot of the African men like, some of the women have complained about me, say, but this is in the book. The music tended to have a heavy rhythmic beat. All right, so some of you nodding your head. Again, Africans like a lot of drum beats, and if you're driving along and pull up at a red light and stop, and you hear some of the very heavy drum beat going, if you look over, it's usually an African inside the car enjoying his music, turning it up really, really loud. Now, folks, I want to say that's hard on your ears. It'll make you go deaf faster than you otherwise should. I say this